Welcome everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are joining us from as part of the Global SCB Network and the Current Conservation Magazine readership. I would like to please ask you before we get started to please make sure that as you join us, where you probably could consider muting yourselves and also turning off your cameras, please. We will welcome everyone to unmute yourselves and to turn your cameras on once we move on to the Q&A session, which will be after we finish the presentation from the speakers. So welcome to the webinar, Saving the World One Joke at a Time, Humor in a Biodiversity Crisis. My name is Ed Gallo, and I am the former SCB VP for Education and Outreach and the current chair of the Global Policy Committee. This event is brought to you by Current Conservation Magazine and the Society for Conservation Biology as part of an ongoing partnership set up since 2021. Current Conservation is a not-for-profit quarterly print and online magazine that works with scientists, science writers, and artists across the world to tell stories from the field of conservation in a manner that engages both scientific and non-scientific audiences. In turn, the Society for Conservation Biology serves as the premier international membership society for professional students and NGOs dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving biodiversity on Earth. It is within the context of this partnership that Current Conservation Magazine is now an affiliate SCB publication. In this webinar, we explore and portray how Humour can be used as a catalyst to support biodiversity conservation. Humour helps build connection and empathy by acknowledging shared human experiences. In conservation, Humour can break down barriers between scientists, practitioners, and the public by humanizing the biodiversity and climate crises. By balancing humor and seriousness, conservation efforts become more approachable, leaving a lasting impact and fostering positive associations. In this webinar, 3 speakers share their experiences of using humor to engage with diverse audiences across a range of media, including improv comedy, satire, and children's fiction. Our lineup of speakers for today include 3 conservation professionals with varied backgrounds. Dan Brockington is an ICREA research professor at the Institute de Ciencias y Tecnología Ambientales of the Universitat Autonoma de Barcelona and leads the Advanced ERC project Conservation Data Justice. Kartik Shanker is a professor at the Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, and trustee at Dakshin Foundation in Bangalore, India. He works on the ecology and evolution of various terrestrial and marine taxa. Sofia Castello y Tickell is the interim director for conservation Optimism and was awarded a PhD in zoology from the University of Oxford in 2021. Her research focuses on marine conservation and effective communication in conservation. Last but not least, again, I would like to remind everyone to please keep your cameras and microphones switched off during the presentations. This webinar will be recorded and made available through SCB's Vimeo channel. The event will comprise 25 minutes of presentations by our speakers, followed by a 25-minute session for Q&A. Without any further ado, please join me with a big round of applause in welcoming Sofia Castello y Tickell. Sofia, please take it away. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Great to see so many people on the webinar. This is amazing. And thank you for that introduction, Ed. I'm going to be talking to you today about a project that I did, combining improvised comedy and conservation. And that was a show, and it was called Wild Thing. So I'm just going to, tell you a little bit about it. This is a statement that our show producer came up with, actually, to talk about our show, kind of in grant applications. And I just thought it was such a brilliant encapsulation of the way that there can be this tension around humour and the biodiversity crisis or conservation, just because, you know, you really need to strike a balance, right? Like, obviously difficult things are happening, the world does not look the way that we want it to, and in some ways somber attitudes are really appropriate. However, they can also be paralyzing or disempowering. And so Ed mentioned that at the moment I'm the interim director for Conservation Optimism. This is something that I've thought about a lot through that role, and we did a literature review last year which actually looked at the way that positive emotions can actually lead to a very different attitude in conservation, right? Things that can really enhance curiosity, creativity, pro-sociality, flexibility, and long-term engagement, all of which, of course, are things that we want and can overlap with humour. Overall, I think that we're seeing kind of this increasing crossover between comedy and the environment. So things like the Ugly Animal Preservation Society, which is a comedy show, the Comedy Wildlife Photo Awards, some children's books like the ones that were written by Danny Rabaiotti or that we're going to hear about later from Dan. And then also these kind of natural history documentaries, which involve comedians. So how do improvised comedy and conservation come together? I realize that a lot of people might not know what improvised comedy is, so I'm happy to tell you a little bit. It is basically making things up in the moment with some sort of structure, but a lot of what I will do are these sort of improvised plays, right? So like you go on stage with, I don't know, 4 or 5 people, sometimes more, but that's how many people we tend to have, like 5 or 6, and essentially make up characters, make up a world within a sort of pre-understood theme and put that on. And you do have some loose overarching structure, which you've agreed beforehand, but it's all invented in the moment. I read a paper that described it as entertainment created spontaneously by making discoveries on stage. And I found that to be really true. Like one of the things that I've really enjoyed about doing improvised comedy is the way that sometimes repeating different scenarios can enable you to explore sort of deeper patterns of what comes up over and over again when you're kind of playing through a scenario. But also something that's really nice about it is that you have an invested audience, right? So they come into the show and then their suggestions, which they give and are kind of called out for and collected, then ultimately actually end up creating the show. So they feel kind of invested in a way. This little timeline is just to give you a sense of the fact that I was not like a theatre kid or like a comedy person for my whole life, right? Like I think that this is something that people can really get involved with kind of at later stages. And it was something that came up kind of quite organically for me. So I was actually doing my PhD in zoology and I was finding myself getting really stuck, kind of like perfectionist. I'm sure anyone who has done a PhD or like a long-term project can identify, but just feeling like, yeah, this kind of perfectionism, this kind of paralysis around getting my project done. And I thought, okay, this might be a good thing for me to do. I went to an improvised comedy workshop and at first hated it because it felt very overwhelming, but then I started really enjoying it and kind of getting on with the people who were doing it. And these were just kind of rehearsals, and then we started to do shows. I actually took on the responsibility of directing a show that was about family dynamics. It was like about a family reunion, and we were just a different type of family each night. And then I kind of had the idea to actually combine conservation and comedy together and put on a show about conservation. So I kind of went to the rest of my group and talked to them and said, like, how would you guys feel about this? I know it's probably going to be a bit different from the other kinds of shows that we've done, like murder mysteries or things like that, or like an improvised reality TV show, but like I think it could be really interesting. So we actually put it on. We did it in Oxford about 2 weeks before the pandemic. And then we revived it earlier this year. And sort of in between, I was having a sort of academic conservation career and then doing conservation optimism stuff as well. So my main aims and goals with this show, just to let you know, were first of all, to use concepts from conservation science to craft a show that was entertaining and sort of potentially moving for a non-scientific audience. Also to encourage the cast and the audience members to reflect upon and connect with conservation, because none of the people that I was working with were conservationists. They were all kind of studying different things or involved in different areas. And then I wanted to communicate the complexity of saving a species, right? Like, I think from the outside, sometimes conservation can look like, hey guys, like just go out and save the world, you know, like just go out and save the whales. And when you're a conservationist, you can understand all of the nuances of that and everything that goes into it, and how much negotiation between different people goes into it, how much lack of understanding we have sometimes about the species and ecosystems that we want to protect, right? So just to try and communicate a little bit of that more human complexity and all of the different people who can be involved, who we don't traditionally think of if you're a person who hasn't really been involved with conservation before. So we got to work developing the show. We kind of, with the cast, I talked through some key concepts in conservation, talked about some real life examples and some case studies just to kind of give them a sense of things. So just as an example, we would talk through, I don't know, something like ecosystem services, right? And I would like come and I would explain to them the concept, and then we would work on using different games to kind of explore it or think about how we could kind of bring it to life or explain it a bit on stage. Or talking about different stakeholders who are involved in conservation, and we would do improvised monologues to think about like, what would this person be thinking? What would a decision maker be thinking? What would a scientist be thinking about kind of the same animal situation? And then at the end of every session, we would have a debrief where we all would kind of sit down and talk about what had happened and what we thought had worked really well, anything that really hadn't, and just, you know, what different perceptions had been. And so that was how we kind of came up with the show plan and just went iterating it. So this is what we came up with in the end, just to kind of walk you through it. The suggestions that we took from the audience were three things. First of all, an adjective, a body part, and an animal. So we had animals that were like, the gigantic toad puffin was one that we just had in Edinburgh. We had like the stinky elbowed sloth, right? So these kind of surreal animals, because part of it was just not wanting to get too stuck in the real world with it, and allowing people to kind of connect with this animal that they felt like was theirs, right? Because it would never emerge again, like it had only happened in that moment. And then we had our sort of hour-long show where we would go through, kind of build this world, introduce all of these characters, and then we would have an unexpected environmental event. So in the second iteration of the show, that was suggested by the audience as well, just to kind of integrate this unexpected nature to it, right? And so it might be a tornado, it might be a tsunami, whatever it was, right? But then the characters needing to adapt. And having this whole town that had been built around the animal that the audience suggested, suddenly seeing those populations crash and needing to change the way that people were relating to that animal, right? So maybe if it was being harvested to make bags, I don't know, whatever it was, just knowing that that needed to change, and then having the negotiations happen between the different characters who were all entangled with each other in some way, right? So they all were kind of knew each other, but the animal was never acted out on stage because we wanted to make sure that that we were focusing more on the human dynamics. In the end, the show, I mean, that at least that first iteration, which is what this is from, went really well. We had some nice reviews. I collected some testimonials, or like the producer collected some testimonials from the different people who were involved in the show. And they talked about how they had kind of learned about conservation, or found it meaningful to kind of build this show structure all together collaboratively. From the audience, we did some audience surveys at the time, and these were kind of some of the results of them. We're actually doing a deeper dive into the show analysis at the moment, because we went up to Edinburgh Fringe in August to do a 6-night run there, and I'm collaborating with Diogo Verissimo, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Oxford. And we did some more in-depth surveys to see whether the show changed people's perceptions of conservation, how, and whether it might change their propensity to donate or not to an environmental charity. So, you know, wait on that. But yeah, so just some quick reflections on what I learned through doing this. First of all, losing control is really hard, right? Like as scientists, I think I'm really used to kind of having a very firm grasp on concepts, and it can be really hard to sort of think about staying true to those while maintaining the freedom to go with an improvised show and build something that's engaging and fun. It was also interesting to see that even within our group, we had people who were a bit more reluctant to take on what they perceived as kind of negative roles, like for example, if it was a hunter or something like that. So we did a lot of work talking through sort of what different stakeholders meant and things like that. And yeah, like I said, we're now doing this kind of deeper project to understand its impacts. With that, I'd just like to thank everyone who's been involved with Wild Things over the years. Here's a list of people, and then also the British Ecological Society, who gave us the grant to help us take the show up to Edinburgh and do those surveys. So that's the end of my presentation. I think we're holding questions for the Q&A, but I will just pass over to Kartik so that he can tell us more about the project that he and Dan have been working on.
You're muted.
Sofia, can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen. I think we just couldn't hear you, but now I can hear you fine.
All right. So, like Sofia, I think Dan and I came to public humor a little, fairly recently. I understand from Dan's friends that he's always been a prankster, but at some point, when we were working together on what we thought was a very serious issue, we sort of accidentally tripped into the character of Carter Shockington. And I'm not going to tell the Shockington story chronologically, but I'm going to start with this article that we wrote that was called Curing Conservation, One Pandemic at a Time, Pandemic at a Time. And in this, we decided to sort of, we thought it was interesting how conservationists tend to be extremely devoted to their study animals, and we thought we'd give those names. And they are a bit like afflictions, are they not? So we had mammilloma, and there are specific subconditions of mammilloma, such as appendicitis and pachydermatitis and orchitis. We had the very special condition of catatonia, and then we also had ornithalgia, which is an obsession with birds, and a common symptom of this disease is twitching, and many other such. My favorite is herpes, since I'm afflicted with it as well. Any of you who's met a herpetologist will know that a symptom is to run after any amphibian or reptile that they see and grab it. Seeing it from a distance isn't good enough. And I have all of these: amphibiosis and serpentitis and schincophrenia and cholera and all of these. This was an article this was a blog that we wrote to sort of highlight and perhaps exalt the relationship that conservationists have with their study animals, and sort of bring out the more underlying sort of phenomena that might then drive both ecological research as well as conservation outcomes. In the last century, a lot of mainstream conservation has revolved around the idea of protecting pristine areas, something that we thought should be called Christianity. Now, where this all started actually was with a form of Christianity that the late E.O. Wilson was advocating through his campaign for Half Earth. And Dan and I thought that E.O. Wilson wasn't going far enough and wasn't doing it right. E.O. Wilson's scheme was had the potential for bias, towards some parts of the world more than others. And we thought he should take a leaf out of Thanos's book, Thanos, arch-villain of the universe in the Marvel series. And when Thanos snapped his fingers and the universe, half the universe disappeared, he obviously used some kind of very advanced randomization algorithm. And we were suggesting that a Half Earth campaign should adopt that. underlying this, of course, underlying this humor, of course, being our critique of the inherent biases that such a conservation approach might have. We went one step further. We hypothesized a world, in 100 years, where everybody had turned vegan, and they were, of course, led by their supreme leader, Ronald Reagan. They were, like in today's world, you would imagine this not to be the perfect harmonious world, but there to be a dozen different sects of vegans, and of course underground in their basement meat labs, which tend to explode occasionally, meat addicts who sort of broke the law and consumed meat, and so that was our sort of exploration of what that trajectory might be. And along this vein, I think a number of other ideas that just popped into our heads. I think the idea of tone of voice was that if we were to take the view that animals must never be interfered with because they had rights, we could take this to all sorts of extremes. If you were not allowed to, I think there's been critiques of course, of hunting and killing animals, but even of conducting research on animals. If we were to take this one step further, I mean, to be honest, animals don't really like being looked at. Most of them do not perceive stares by other mammals to be friendly, and so we argued then that taking this to a logical extreme, one should stop looking at them entirely. We accused nature of being responsible for most of the extinctions in history, and argued that nature should not be trusted to run things herself, and that we should take charge completely and run things as the nature zoo. There was pushback against this from the animal kingdom. They wrote a series of mails to us complaining about a whole range of issues. Tigers complained about deer, the grass complained about the deer running away, grass complained about the deer eating them, and so on. There were other bizarre sort of things that happen in nature that the animals were unhappy with sibling relationships, marital relationships, and so on. Shockington remained a friendly year for all of this, including allelopathic assassins. And I think in one of our digressions, we imagined what the world might look like if we took reforestation to another level, and argued that if we really did this well, we should plant trees in space, trees on trees, trees in lakes, trees in the poles, and so on. So we've sort of explored every angles that we think have the potential for logical reasoning, or unreasoning, as you might call it, as you might think of it, including instances where well-constructed maps by GIS experts classified landscapes somewhat differently from the way they actually were, from tiger habitats to coastal areas, that sands that shifted unnecessarily and made cartographers' lives miserable, and so on. We weren't happy with this, with just sort of like with these calling out, making fun of ideas that we thought had potential. In one of our series, we gave out awards to the best ideas. I think the first one was the David Attenborough building for being the most powerful protected area generating machine. And finally, we accidentally, having spawned Carter Shockington, we also at some point appear to have spawned this conservationist called Shocktail Cartington, and then of course had to go into the origin story of Cartington, which is also available for anyone who's interested. So Dan and I essentially have used Shockington, I think, as a platform for venting our deepest feelings about conservation. It's therapy for us, but we're hoping that it also sort of brings to light some of the some of the issues in conservation that we need to talk more about in a less satirical manner. Thank you. And at this point, I'll hand over to Dan.
Thank you, Kartik, and do just well, don't leave the slide up then, but just on the cartel Brockington thing, since we heard so much from Sofia's, and it was so interesting to learn how it's actually produced. What happens is generally Kartik or I write each other a mail saying what's going on here, or sometimes Kartik just says, this has come out, you need to saddle up and we need to start writing. If you accept this submission, please press yes, etc., etc. And I just look forward to those mails so much. And it tends to prioritize, to jump to the top of our priorities, but then it takes quite a long time because a lot of what we say isn't particularly funny. First time out, we have to work out how to rephrase it. It's tempting to do the lazy thing and be sarcastic, and we really try not to do that. We're much keen on being more ridiculous than sarcastic, to extend things to strange conclusions, just to see what happens when we do. And there are rules like we're two old men who don't understand stuff, so we're probably going to be making a fool of ourselves in some way, so we need to get second opinions. We can't make fun of junior scholars, that kind of stuff. So we're trying to explore the ethics of this as much as we're pushing the boundaries. Somebody pointed out to me in the cultural wars in the States that comedians are up on the front line. So this is it's both fun and we hope funny, but also incredibly serious. Let me try and share my screen now, because I want to talk a little bit about children's writing. And let me see if I can get the thing to do that. So I share that. Can you see everything put up? And if I put this in, okay. So you should see the children's writing without humour. And hopefully it's hidden all my notes behind this. Okay, so children's writing is something that I began around about 5 or 6 years ago now. And in the context here, what I want to argue is that actually it's almost impossible, it should be impossible to write children's books, especially children's books about conservation, without using humour. This is actually, rather than thinking how we might introduce it, as we've been listening so far, here I'd want to argue the opposite. You can't do without it. And we can see this from the basic rules of how it works. On the one hand, children love exciting stories, which are interesting to read. They want characters or plots, hopefully which will make them laugh. And crucially, they like to identify with their characters. They like to imagine themselves in their characters' shoes. And very often, particularly the middle grade kids, the 8 to 13-year-olds that I'm most interested in, they like to imagine their characters overcoming adversity. If we think back to all the books we've read as children, there's very often been some sort of adventure, some trial, some difficulty, which the children have overcome, and which the children overcome rather than adults overcoming for them. Children can get really invested in their books. They're very good at hating the bad people we write. And if we look at the times when children are reading and how much they're reading, then the golden age is really between 7 and 13. That's when we see children increasing more and more their reading once they learn the joys, once they learn to read and then learn the joys and rewards of doing so. But 7 to 13 is the middle grade, and there's a massive difference between the lower and the upper middle grade books. So mistakes, well, this is what you learn when you join things like the Society for Children's Writers and Book Illustrators in the UK, or in the Tanzanian Writers Forum, which I'm part of too. Children don't like instruction manuals. They don't want a textbook. sentences, words, paragraph which look too long and complicated, something which is too didactic, where they're being told what to think. They and there are mistakes as well, such as infodumps, as they're called in the trade, including large chunks of fact into the plot. Another classic is telling things rather than showing them, being didactic. There's a wonderful phrase which is misattributed to Chekhov. He almost said it. He said, "Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glitter of its light on broken glass." And that's key to writing powerfully. It's not telling people what is happening, but showing them what is going on through our characters' behavior, through the description and the environment, through their interactions with each other. And another important aspect is getting the point of view right, where you typically in children's writing, one's either writing in the first person, which I find very hard, or in the third person singular, but from a close third person. So you're sitting on that person's shoulder, looking at what they're looking at, seeing what they're seeing, which means, of course, you can't write about that person's face because they can't see their own face most of the time, but rather we see the scene through one person's point of view. And you by doing that, one builds a close relationship with them. Now, applying these rules, I think, necessitates being funny. And it's, well, in the UK published output, it's remarkable actually how many books get through which aren't funny. It's difficult to be funny, and it could be improved by being more funny. But basically, when we bring conservation causes into our children's book, we want to identify, we want our readers to identify with our characters, so which suggests you make your characters the conservationists. We want them to overcome adversity, which suggests they need to fight conservation battles and to overcome bad characters and to win these battles through that. These battles need to be exciting. Now, I put it to you that it's actually very hard to do that well unless we can do this with humour. I've been writing a book which is coming out in Tanzania shortly. It's a book about actually based on my wife's family, lives near a forest reserve in East Africa. And the main character is called Santi, and she has various adventures in the forest in which she's been growing up and living, which is a reserve forest. And part of the reason why I was interested in writing this is that I was struck by the fact that in English children's literature, we have quite a few heroes who are both poachers and white. I was thinking Robin Hood and Danny the Champion of the World, Sam Gribley and My Side of the Mountain, if you can remember that far back. And I couldn't think of any equivalents of poachers who were not white. If you know them, of those stories, then please let me know. But Robin Hood is one of the most successful stories ever told in the English language. It's quite a powerful thing. We have lots of stories of people who are saving wildlife from poachers who are white. So the anti-poaching teams are white, but the poaching heroes and heroines, I couldn't see them. And I was interested in seeing what would happen if we told stories about conservation, which pointed out that some of the laws which make poaching may not seem so obvious from the point of view of people like Santi. And humour comes into this in several ways, because we have multiple encounters between Santi and various foreign visitors. So here is Ben explaining to a class of children why and how he loves forests, and Santi is completely mistranslating what he's saying, because the children are actually asking him a whole bunch of different questions about where he was bitten in his pants by the safari ants that he trodden by mistake. So there's an obvious set of jokes that one can tell about interactions between different cultures and the sorts of mistakes that get made. But I also didn't want the focus of this book to be about the Wazungu, the people coming in from overseas. Rather, although that is a quite important part of it, and so we play about with tropes of how different guests from different parts of Africa are seen, as well as people from Europe and elsewhere. But I also wanted lots of the story, the jokes, to be about the interactions which take place in Santi's family, about the difficulties of learning Swahili, for example, in cultures like this, the sorts of everyday interactions one sees and is part of as growing up, and to make the humour much more Tanzanian focused. And the learning journey for me has been to find ways to express all of this, whereby any conservation message comes through not because I say, here is a conservation message, or here is something that I want people to learn and understand, but rather because of the things that Santi does and says and thinks and feels, the main character of my book. And from that, and from the way in which children can engage with that, which has to involve the jokes, for them to for the conservation messages to come through from that. But Kartik was there before me. He was writing children's books before I began to, and I think, Kartik, you're going to talk about some of those now. Is that okay?
Oops. Yeah, so I think I just have a couple of examples. This is from a book about a little girl in the Lakshadweep Islands that, for the first girl who's in the family who learns how to swim and snorkel and learns to love coral reefs and reef fish. And this again was an entirely accidental panel that compared fish to the people in her family. I think there's from my audience, there's two panels. There's another really beautiful one, which pretty much the entire face. The panel is the moon, which is what the story is about. But this one, more than any of the others, really sort of seemed to catch their attention. And so I think we often find ways in which humor becomes a hook even in children's writing. Go on, Dan. I think we'll skip this one. Do you have the other one on Laurie after this? I think we're running out of time. So, no, I was just going to say that in the books that I've written, just as Dan said, there's most of my books are about talking animals, and we found, as in Shockington, that absurdity is a good tool, but it's also something that appeals to children particularly, and so on the one hand, there's the Shockington stuff that we do but I think we find that it's the tools pervade a lot of the other writing that we do as well. I'll just stop there. I think we've gone on long enough, Dan, so I think we can stop and talk.
Thank you, Kartik, Dan, Sofia. I didn't introduce myself earlier. I am Devati, the executive editor of Current Conservation, and I have the distinct privilege of looking at first drafts of Carta or Shockington articles. That's when Kartik and Dan say, does this make sense to you? Do you get this reference, or is it just too old for our audience? So thank you to the three of you for sharing all of your experiences. We now have about 20 minutes, actually less than 20 minutes for Q&A. And while the questions are coming in, either in the chat box or, feel free to raise your hand and then you can ask yourself. I wanted to kind of throw this discussion open to the audience in case anybody had their own personal experiences of using humor for conservation and whether they'd like to share that. And sorry, just one request. Can everybody speak a little slowly? Because I think some people are struggling to keep up if English isn't their first language. Thank you. Okay, we could start going through the questions then. Okay, so would you, Tuyeni, would you like to ask this question yourself? It's about the diversity of examples, which are all focused on children. And what about material for adults, they ask. And also for Sofia, what is the best way to ensure that humor is brought out throughout your entire improv act? How do you keep it light besides the weird animal names?
So on the children, Tuyeni, and thanks for this, and lovely to be talking with you. Castle Brockington's aimed at adults. It's quite yes, it's more senior, and I think Sofia's is also for a more adult audience. It's just that the children's writing, the books at Kartik and I, which are focused on children, and I don't think we've tried to do a serious, funny novel about for adults. The master here is Ben Elton, Some Other Eden, which I'll put in the chat. It is absolutely hilarious. He's amazing.
Yeah, I can answer the second question, the one that you mentioned, Devati, about humor being throughout the improv act. So I think one of the best things that I learned when I started doing improv, and one of the lessons that most improv teachers will tell you first of all, is like, don't try to be funny. Like, if you know that actually humor really just emerges from whatever happens very often. So like, if you're not trying to be funny in a scene, like something will happen that will make people laugh, and like you sometimes don't even quite understand why, you know. And so quite often, like the big laughs, like they're not planned, you know, like it'll just be about something funny that someone says in an interaction with someone else. And so a lot more of what's planned is kind of like the themes of what we talk about. But actually, like a lot of the people that I perform with are just like super talented, you know, and like they'll just, I don't know, just come up with things that just make people laugh a lot, but aren't necessarily kind of intended to be that way. That said, there are also quite a lot of parts in our show that are like quite sad, or can be quite shocking sometimes. Like I remember we had one scene where someone was like chopping the hooves off a giraffe because they had like some kind of special property, right? And in that show we actually had, I think, some children who had come to that show. And I remember like, but everyone in the audience was just gasping, you know, because they were like, like, how can you be doing this? Even though it was an imaginary giraffe, right? And in many ways, I think the kind of sadder moments where like a couple of performers have an argument, you know, or an animal dies or whatever it is, like a lot of that actually then leads to like a bigger release of tension in laughter later on in the show. Because you kind of need to have this balance. Like it can't all be just like ha 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 the whole way through. It's more about taking people on this kind of ride, I'd say. Yeah. I don't know which question we want to answer next, Devati.
So you might have kind of answered this, but Nina asked if you could share a bit about some of the funniest things to happen.
Yeah, sure. I think one of my favorite moments was just now when we performed it last. We had a show which was this, I think it was the smelly elbowed sloth. And part of the kind of show about it was that the smell, like there was like some kind of scent gland in the sloth that could then kind of be extracted and used, and it could influence people, you know, so it's all like quite imaginary. But there was an activist who was like chaining herself to a building like by the elbows, and then came up with this chant that was like, smells off for sloths, you know, and it was just like repeating that, and the whole audience got in on it, and they just kept on shouting it. Like even when we were in kind of like a different scene, they would suddenly start advocating for the sloths, and that was quite funny. I don't know if it translates like now. Quite often improv is like funnier in the moment, but that was a really nice moment where it felt like the whole audience was very on board with us.
Thanks, Sofia. Yeah, Jenya, do you mind asking that question yourself, if you don't mind unmuting? All right, I will read it out. I think, Kartik, maybe you might want to answer this. It's about reptiles. So they say reptiles are not, okay, their internet is unstable. Reptiles are not as charismatic for the general public and are often generally described as dangerous. Have you ever participated in projects where you used humor or the arts to promote the conservation for these species in a way that clears up the misconception that reptiles are scary and dangerous?
I think a lot of people have. I mean, I think a little bit perhaps in contrast to the public sort of wildlife image of how people interact with these large and dangerous reptiles on National Geographic and Discovery, where it's just sort of almost like blowing out of proportion, the danger element of it. One of the things that I remember is, the first time I went to the Madras Crocodile Bank, there was this big, giant sort of like skin of a crocodile. And unlike at zoos and museums, there's this big board below it that said, "Please touch," right? and sort of like the surprise element of that was, in a sense, I think it wasn't humor per se, but I think surprise also is a good tool to engage people in. And I think a lot of herpetologists who do outreach programs, use the herpetologist thing, which is like we like to handle animals, right? And we handle them, not venomous snakes. Those are the inebriated herpetologists taking selfies. But the responsible ones are, they're actually playing up the desire that herpetologists have to handle animals. So the caricature that I had is really the caricature we make of ourselves in public. We're like, see, I can hold an animal. Here's a big snake. I like holding snakes. Here's a frog. Hold the frog. Hold the frog. I mean, you don't see ornithologists doing that, right? So I think I'm sort of like maybe even thinking about it like as we speak, but the self caricature that most herpetologists are is sort of the humor element in sort of lightening this relationship that one has with these otherwise sort of like viewed as creepy crawly animals.
Thanks, Kartik. Dan, do you have anything to add?
Well, yes, just as a general principle, if you've got a general public perception of that will guarantee that your readers will act and react in certain ways, and that is a goal for an author. Because it makes it easier to build in the plot twists, to build in the surprises, because you know that the audience is likely to read what you've written in a certain way. So if you can come up with a story about the problems and difficulties of reptiles, for example, and then build in the twist, which will have your readers desperate to refute that popular narrative. So that's actually it's almost advantageous when you have that sort of common public perception.
Thanks, Dan. There's quite a few examples in the chat that maybe you can look at later, but people that Jerry, for instance, has published a book in 2014, and someone else has added a perspective on writing for a large age range audience. But I wanted to quickly jump to another question that came up, and Mary Francis asks, do you have any experience doing these conservation campaigns at ground level, for example, with fishermen as an audience, and how do you check if the message is being misinterpreted?
So if I could answer from an academic perspective, it's difficult to check if our messages are being misinterpreted when we publish an academic paper. It's even harder with comedy and humor. I think you just have to expect that there will be a multitude of misinterpretations of your messages, and it's actually, and I'd love to know what you make of this, Sofia, because engaging with audiences and dealing with what happens as it's happening is crucial to improv, but with writing it's a much more slow feedback process.
Yeah, I think there's like an immediacy to improv, which is quite nice in that, like, you do have very immediate feedback from people, as in if they laugh at something, they're clearly enjoying it, right? Or like at least they found it funny. And so you can have a sense of what to lean into or not. That said, if people don't understand things, then it can be kind of like not knowing whether people understand things. Like that's not something that I would generally get told after a performance, you know? Like for the most part, people would just leave and think it or like tell their friends, but they quite rarely tell us. And I think that that's part of the reason that I was really, really keen to do this more in-depth survey study, just because we didn't actually check kind of like understanding of basic messages, but just to understand the impact of what we were saying. I mean, and I don't have experience, I guess, with a conservation campaign, but in my kind of more academic experience of doing surveys, I do know that, like, for example, it's quite important to do things like piloting, right? And so that's going to be maybe obvious to a lot of people on this call, but just going out and trying out your surveys, you know, checking with people to say, hey, like, you know, how did you understand this question, whatever. And sometimes doing back translations as well, because part of my experience, well, I mean, first of all, what's funny in one culture is like not funny in another necessarily, like at all. So if you were trying to do something funny, like somewhere that you didn't have like a quite close understanding of the culture, I think it would be quite difficult and quite likely to land badly, right? But yeah, I don't know. I definitely, so I mean, a lot of my research I did in Mexico, which is where I grew up, and so I'm kind of fluent in both languages and understand both cultures to an extent. But I know that, for example, some friends have recommended, like, I don't know, you just try to check in with people, back translate when you can, all that kind of stuff to see if things are landing. But there's no kind of exact way of doing it, and I don't think we can ever be fully sure.
Sorry, I can't tell if there was a question there, but thank you, Sofia. Are there any more questions from the audience? Oh, there we go. There's a rather long question here. Kai, would you want to unmute and ask this question yourself? Okay, I guess that's a no. So Kai asks, what innovative strategies can be employed to seamlessly integrate humor into conservation messages, making it a powerful tool for raising awareness and inspiring action to resonate with specific audiences, such as urban dwellers or indigenous communities, to effectively address their unique environmental concerns and perspectives? Feel free to jump in. Any one of you.
I mean, it's a really good question. I'm not sure that I really have an answer for you, right? Like, it's a really complicated question. And I think especially because of this kind of sometimes disconnect in what's funny. So yeah, I mean, I know that, for example, I have seen some studies of people who went out and did, this is more like theatre, but going out and doing kind of theatre interventions where they either like performed plays to people or actually did something called, it's related, it's called like Theatre of the Oppressed, where people actually will take part in scenes, right? So like they can kind of tap in and like act from their perspective with people who are facilitating it. And there have been some studies looking at the impacts that that had on people's understanding, for example, of I mean, the example I saw was around domestic violence. And so they went to a bunch of different communities and did these performances and then checked back in to see how people's perceptions had changed. So that's really cool. But I don't necessarily know of anything specific that I can answer your question with. Other than that, I don't know if Dan or Kartik do.
I think one of the things that we've struggled with, and I struggled with when I'm asked, what the messaging is in my writing, is that it's hard to be creative and to be and to have, a goal at the end in mind when you start. Stories tend to sort of take their own paths. Humor tends to take its own path, and at least for myself, I don't feel like I know what the message is at the end of the product when I start, right? And if you do write with a very write or do theater or music with a message at the end of it, the creativity is going to suffer in some fashion, or the process is going to suffer. So I think that, you know, when you engage with the process, the idea is for ideas to emerge both from yourself as well as from your audience, whether it's to literature or theater. And I don't feel like we control the narrative entirely as people who initiate the the thing. That's my answer. I mean, I don't write towards a conservation message. If it emerges, then so be it. But as long as it made people think about it, that's sort of like yay.
Thanks, Kartik. Dan, we have about a minute left in case. Yeah,
I would just add, why ask for innovative strategies? The question is, what makes for really good comedy? If we're interested in conservation, then that's the theme that will be what it will be about. But there are well-known ways of doing good improvisation, good writing, good cartoons, which will make people laugh. We can draw upon what's well known for conservation purposes.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly add something more, there are so many amazing resources being put into the chat by people. I've been trying to like copy paste as many of them as I can, but like, yeah, I mean, it's just been really nice to see everyone putting these recommendations for books and papers and everything like that. I've got a lot to read.
Yeah,
Great.
One of our participants is really upset that we didn't actually tell any jokes. So we'll take that as advice for our next session.
Yeah, we'll do that in the
Another
next
time.
hour. Okay.
Awesome. Great. So we would like to thank hugely to all our three speakers, Sofia, Kartik, and Dan, for having shared with us so much wealth of knowledge, expertise, and experience in the role of humor in conservation and how we can use it to potentially advance conservation in creative and engaging ways. And with that, the webinar has concluded, and I would invite you to reach out to any of the speakers. I see some interest from some people to follow up with more resources, which I believe the speaker will be happy to share with the audience. Thank you very much to everyone, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thank you.